Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're tackling one of the most talked about and debated wars of our time, the Iraq War. We're going to dig into the reasons behind it, the events that unfolded, and its lasting effects. There's a lot to cover, so grab a seat, and let's go on this journey through history. To understand why the US decided to invade Iraq, we need to step back a bit. Saddam Hussein, Iraq's dictator, was in power since 1979. By the 1990s, Iraq had been through one war with Iran and another with a coalition led by the US in the Gulf War of 1991. In the aftermath of the Gulf War, the US and United Nations imposed strict sanctions on Iraq. These sanctions were supposed to prevent Saddam from developing weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. However, despite intense scrutiny, Saddam's regime kept the world guessing. Were they hiding something, or was it just a bluff? Then came September 11, 2001. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon changed everything. The Bush administration, looking for ways to prevent future terrorist attacks, began viewing Iraq and other regimes as potential threats. So now we have a perfect storm: Saddam's suspicious WMD programs, a post-9/11's fear of terrorism, and a growing push for regime change in Iraq. All of this set the stage for what was to come. With Iraq on the radar, the US began presenting intelligence suggesting that Saddam's regime still had active WMD programs. The Bush administration argued that Iraq was a clear and present danger, that they could potentially provide these weapons to terrorist groups. They said Saddam had links to al-Qaeda, though no conclusive evidence was ever found. Through late 2002 and early 2003, President George W. Bush and his team worked hard to convince the American public and the world that Iraq needed to be stopped. But not everyone was convinced. France, Germany, Russia, and many countries around the world argued that inspections were working and that there was no need for war. In March 2003, the US, along with the UK, Australia, and a few other allies, moved forward with a plan to invade Iraq. The goal: to remove Saddam Hussein from power and make sure Iraq could no longer threaten anyone with WMDs. On March 20, 2003, the invasion began. The world witnessed what was called shock and awe, a massive air campaign intended to quickly dismantle Iraq's ability to fight back. Within weeks, US forces swept into Baghdad, and by April 9th, Saddam's statue was famously toppled in Firdos Square, symbolizing the fall of his regime. It seemed like a swift victory, but in reality, this was only the beginning of a much longer and more complex battle. After toppling Saddam's government, the US set up the Coalition Provisional Authority, or CPA, to run Iraq. They aimed to rebuild Iraq's political institutions and create a new democratic government. But the decisions by the CPA had major consequences. First, disbanding the Iraqi military, and second, banning former Ba'ath Party members from government jobs. This left a lot of Iraqis unemployed, angry, and with no stake in the new Iraq. A growing insurgency soon emerged, made up of former soldiers, Ba'ath loyalists, and religious militants. The violence intensified, with attacks on US soldiers and suicide, bombings targeting both coalition forces and Iraqi civilians. This period was chaotic. Different groups fought for power, and extremist groups like al-Qaeda in Iraq took advantage of the instability. What started as a war to remove Saddam became a battle against an insurgency. By 2006, Iraq was in chaos. Sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia groups was tearing communities apart. The violence reached such levels that people feared civil war. In 2007, the US responded with a strategy known as the Surge. This involved sending an additional 30 troops and partnering with local Sunni tribes to push back against al-Qaeda and other insurgent groups. This strategy helped to reduce violence temporarily, but it didn't solve the underlying issues. By 2008, the US was beginning to think about ending its presence in Iraq. The war had become hugely unpopular back home, with high costs in both lives and money. Under President Obama, the U.S. started reducing its troop numbers. By 2011, U.S. forces completed their withdrawal from Iraq. But as history would show, the story was far from over. After U.S. troops left, Iraq still faced many challenges. The government was unstable, and divisions between Sunni and Shia groups continued. Out of this turmoil, a new threat emerged: ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. ISIS took control of large parts of Iraq, leading to another cycle of violence that brought the U.S. back into Iraq to support the Iraqi army. So, even though the U.S. officially left in 2011, Iraq has remained a key focus in the fight against extremism. The Iraq War had huge consequences. It reshaped U.S. foreign policy and left a lasting impact. On the Middle East, the war claimed thousands of lives and displaced millions. Many argue it created the conditions that allowed groups like ISIS to emerge. At home, Americans question their government, their military, and the cost of spreading democracy by force. Some people think the Iraq War was justified. Others see it as a costly mistake. What do you think? Was the Iraq War necessary, or was it a tragic miscalculation? Let's talk about it in the comments. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the Iraq War. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more history videos. See you next time.